Welcome to Civic Warriors, brought to you by Witham. On this podcast, we bring the conversation to you, sharing engaging stories that motivate and build consensus in the nonprofit community. This podcast is about the innovators, the leaders on the front lines of adversity, guiding lights in the nonprofit industry affecting change. And through their stories, we can all join forces to become Civic Warriors. Hey, Warriors. Welcome to today's episode of Civic Warriors, brought to you by Witham. I'm your host, Brad Caruso, leader of Witham's not-for-profit practice. Today's guest is Michael Pearson, President and CEO of Public Health Management Corporation, or PHMC. PHMC is a not-for-profit organization whose mission is to create and sustain healthier communities through partnerships with government, foundations, businesses, and community-based organizations. Originating as the Philadelphia Health Management Corporation, PHMC was established to address the public health needs of the greater Philadelphia region through outreach, health promotion, education, research, planning, technical assistance, and direct services. Over the past 5 decades, PHMC has evolved into one of the nation's largest and most comprehensive public health institutes. Michael carries a very storied background in business as well as in not-for-profit management, not only from his time at PHMC, but as well as other ventures that he's involved with. And we can learn some really valuable insights. In my short time working with Michael, I've noticed a lot of very important facts and a lot of information that a lot of the not-for-profit world and community can benefit from. So with all that said, Michael, welcome to our show.
Brad, happy to be here this morning.
Yeah, so Michael, where I always love to start and what I love to hear from our guests is a little bit about your background, talking a little bit about your career and where did it start and how did you get to PHMC?
Well, we'll start with how I got to PHMC. I was a long-serving board member, actually over 10 years, and I had retired from what was an entrepreneurial career in which I had sold a business to private equity. Upon that sale, PHMC was experiencing a lot of change, and then it was suggested by the board if I could come on as interim CEO, which I did. Now, if we backtrack and look at my background, I at one point was a military officer. I was a corporate lackey, for lack of a better term, for some Fortune 500 companies in New York. And then finally, I set out to restore what were opportunities that were afforded my parents. And that was a working class environment in which you could rise to middle class. And my parents being products of Alabama that were part of the Great Migration to the North for Jim Crow residents of the South, i.e. African Americans who were subjected to what were historically bad times. My parents took that opportunity with their families. They met in Philadelphia, married, and subsequently my father was exposed to sonship, and sonship exposed my family to economic opportunity. Well, those jobs disappeared, and I formed a company called Union Packaging after I left corporate America, which was Westvaco. It subsequently merged in several iterations. Those iterations include WestRock. I think that's the final thing it merged into. But anyway, that was a large paper and packaging company, which I had gone to after a career with Pfizer. And Pfizer is where I landed outside in the civilian world once I left the military. So subsequently, I had great opportunities with companies that were on the rise. Pfizer was not the largest pharmaceutical company in the world when I got there, and it became so. So with those increases in size and opportunity, I was afforded professional opportunities that advanced career, gave me a lot of challenges. However, that concern for the job opportunities led me to go back to Pennsylvania and start what became Union Packaging. Ultimately, that was sold to the Pritzker family office, and that sale afforded me an opportunity to take some time while in my 50s and think about what I wanted to do next. And that led to real estate development. And as a partner in Ironstone, I've been fortunate to have my other 4 partners engaged in what I will call again, socially responsible real estate development where we've taken very tough projects and tried to get the community engaged them again. So that's a long-winded answer to how I got here.
Love it. Yeah, no, it's a great answer. And there certainly is a lot of background that you bring on a variety of levels. I get a lot of leadership lessons actually from military officer related texts and books and things like that, because I know there's a lot of principles I take from that and apply. But not only that, you've been an entrepreneur, you've worked your way up to where you are. There's a whole host of values that you're bringing to your position. And I think most leaders that I encounter have storied background like that, or multiple different avenues of how they got to where they are, and then take that and bring good to the world, continue to thrive. So, I really appreciate that, and not long-winded at all. I think that gives a lot of people background about your expertise as well as kind of the value that you've brought to PHMC. So you went from being a board member of PHMC to being the CEO of PHMC. What made you passionate about PHMC's mission? And I think executive director, president, CEO is a very difficult job in not-for-profit. What made you so passionate about it to step into that role and change the lens of your work relationship with PHMC from board member to president and CEO?
First of all, PHMC in those 50 years has grown, and that growth was largely due to opportunities being presented by funders. And those funders had trust, knowing that PHMC was mission-oriented in delivering those services. So you saw a growth from not just physical health to behavioral health to intermediary work. You've seen it expand into project management and other areas. Example would be the project management for the city of Philadelphia's rebuild project in the Olney Rec Center. Well, long story short, I appreciated the impact that the organization had on the lives of Philadelphians, Pennsylvanians, etc. And that impact was one in which, I know it sounds like a very simple mission, but making the communities healthier. And why is that important to me? Well, I've been fortunate to have access to great medical care and things that others simply may not have. And that was largely due to, while my family thrived, I had relatives and friends that were not as blessed in terms of economic opportunity and depended on many of the services that PHMC provided. And that sympathy grew into action and was one of the reasons I had joined the board some more than 10 years ago. But in that board work, I learned that the skills that I had acquired as an entrepreneur and business person were badly needed for a nonprofit to navigate the waters as an organization grows. And PHMC grew to about 350 million top line when I got there. The addition of the Early Learning Resource Center contracts have now put that top line about 950 million. Well, when you're at that level and you have grown, sometimes the infrastructure necessary to support that growth is not present. And professionalizing and frequently borrowing some of the things from for-profit organizations to add that institutional structure were nice to haves, but right now they're mandatory, especially in this environment where we see many social service funds being reduced. So it has a nimbleness required that frequently you see in business, but in many respects I saw as being absent in the nonprofit world.
A lot of people can learn from that. And when you go into an organization that's in growth mode, going from, as you mentioned, 350 million to 900 million, that's an extraordinary leap. I know even in my own personal profession and business, we have been going through something similar over the last several years. And, the infrastructure that it takes and the forethought of infrastructure before it happens, not necessarily as it's happening or after it happens, it's sometimes hard to unwind. And when you're consolidating businesses and bringing things in, you're not only saying, hey, we want this as part of our mission, but also like we're a business. How do we integrate this business into our existing, suite of businesses? It's a very extraordinarily difficult thing to do. And your expertise in doing that certainly is very valuable. And your connection to the mission, helps support that. But you need, in general, you definitely need both, as you mentioned. You need to have both the passion for the business, but also you need to have the sense of, just because I have this passion for this business, we need to be thoughtful about how we grow it. We need to have the infrastructure related to be able to grow it. And certainly, bringing that to the table is very important for organizations that are in this, mergers and acquisitions occurring to help solve a public need, right? Your initial premise, as you said, was you have a passion to solve a public need. And as you know, there's, a significant number of services that are needed to help solve a public need. It's not just housing. It's not just case management. It's not just having accessibility to clinicians. There's a whole host of things that are needed. And your organization has figured out a way to bring that all together and help expand your reach as an organization to the greater Philadelphia area and wider than that, obviously. You talked a little bit about it, Michael, but maybe share a little bit more about a couple of the specific programs that PHMC has, just to give the audience a little more general understanding of PHMC itself.
I'll focus in on a couple. One I'll start with is the Center for Autism. The Center for Autism is a way to provide service for autistic individuals and their families in which they're engaged in meaningful, what we'll call non-academic service. However, that frequently links with parents and families that struggle to access providers of services. They struggle to learn about how should autism be handled, because the spectrum has widened over the years. And with that widening of the spectrum becomes a broadened diagnosis, but that's also led into a decline in very specific services for those members of the autistic spectrum that really require a lot of care and are not highly functioning. So our goal is to make sure those individuals who are not as adapted to being in society are provided a safe environment on a daily basis. And that's an oversimplification, but it's a specific gap in that plethora of service we could widely call providing to the autistic community. And as an example, you've probably recently heard the Philadelphia Eagles have gathered a lot of momentum, but that is geared towards research, not providing services. And then there's yet another portion of that spectrum, and that's direct educational service. And then there are highly functioning individuals that would like to transition. So we fill a very specific gap at the Center for Autism, but not unlike what we do, as I mentioned in earlier comments, the ELRC, or Early Learning Resource Centers. And those are based on a county basis, and we service 3 counties in southeastern Pennsylvania, in which parents are linked with services to accelerate and allow their children to keep pace in their early developmental years so they don't lose time by getting behind academically. And it's supportive services to keep them on pace with their classmates. And that's another example of what I would call very diverse behavioral health elements. And then I'll give you an example of a direct physical health example, which would be our FQHCs, or the federally qualified health centers, which are government mandated opportunities to provide clinical support for individuals who are in need of primary care, but may not have access to insurance. We have multiple locations. They turn no patient away, but they're also a very difficult business model because it's heavily dependent on the Medicaid mix, payer mix. And that has drastically changed. As many of you are aware in the news, we've seen Medicaid funding formulas change. So that presents a challenge, which we want to keep in what we will call our continuum of care wheel. But that will be a challenge going forward and will have to be figured out by the organization. Another example of programming, which would seem very different within the same organization, would be the services we provide as an intermediary for the city of Philadelphia for the nonviolence work. And again, a very simple way to understand that is there are multiple community groups that provide on-the-street counseling that prevent people from committing violent crime. Well, they have to have funding. They have to meet criteria. The city doesn't do that. They give it to PHMC to monitor for them. And that's a classic example of intermediary work. And then finally, I'll talk about research and development. This is an element of PHMC where we're looking to measure outcomes from social services in a way to, and you'll hear this become more and more critical, measuring outcome. Funders are demanding that proof be provided, and that requires what I will call very technical skills to draft and keep track of data in a way that it can present outcomes that are easily digested by those organizations. That's not all of our programs, but that's just a brief summary of some of the things we do.
Yeah, addressing a significant number of different needs that the community faces. And I think that's the unique part about the organization is that you address and solve so many unique challenges. But speaking on that last point that you said, as far as measurable outcomes, that's definitely a very, very common talked about point. A couple of the guests I've had on recently, I always ask them this question, and I'll probably go off a little bit here and just ask you, how do you define impact? Whenever I hear measuring outcomes, I think of the word impact. That's, what is the impact we're making? And to your point, a lot of funders are now switching their mindset to how did you spend our dollars to how did you make an impact on our community, or how did you make an impact with the dollars we did give you? There's been an extremely heightened focus on that on the federal level, on the local level, on the funder level, private funder level. So from your perspective, Michael, how would you define impact? Obviously you are making an impact, but how do you define that?
Well, I'll use a metaphor to capture the essence of that question. Several years ago, I had the benefit during the President Obama years of visiting Cuba. And during that trip, I learned a couple of things. Number one, Cuba is largely the same land mass as Pennsylvania, and Cuba is also roughly the same population. And I'm smoothing out here and there statistically. But what struck me was we talk about the disparity in health outcomes. And I'm going to focus on my community as an African American, largely being of the same genetic composition as those inhabitants in Cuba, the Afro-Cubans, and me being an African American. Why statistically do Cuban and more precisely Afro-Cubans have a higher life expectancy and a lower infant mortality rate? Here in Pennsylvania, where we have arguably some of the best medical facilities in the world. If you look at CHOP for childcare will rank 1 or 2 in the nation. University of Pennsylvania, Temple, Pitt, all these great medical systems for advanced care. Well, how could we have those numbers not performing better than Cuba in the middle of these great advanced research facilities? And the answer is we haven't focused on outcomes that would move the needle on primary care. And when we're effective in measuring those things and changing the game would be PHMC would disappear if those numbers could disappear in terms of the gap between Cuba and the United States on primary care. Some basic numbers. So impact is, if I go back to our gun violence engagement, while we're an intermediary, we're part of a continuum of service that has lowered the death rate by violence statistically in the city of Philadelphia. Well, what's that mean? Well, it means less people are killed in Philadelphia compared to many years ago. So that's a good example of impact. When things get fluffy and they're not measurable, that does not mean that a nonprofit is not impactful in what they're doing. It may mean that we haven't had a way to measure it, or we may be asking the wrong questions on what to measure.
Interesting. Yeah. What is the premise? Yeah. What are we trying to solve for? Or how do we define what we're trying to solve for? And I imagine that changes over time as well. I imagine what we're trying to solve for today is maybe not what we're trying to solve for tomorrow. I mean, I think the COVID pandemic upended most of our mindset towards a lot of things, and it changed how we have to approach many things and how we have to approach specific outcomes. So I imagine that premise itself changes a lot over time. But yeah, great example you just gave there, because it's you're in the middle of some of the greatest medical institutions in the world, and but why is the needle not moving? And you have to, as you said, look at the data itself and understand, what are we trying to solve for? How are we trying to solve it? And what tactics are we taking to try to solve it? Because maybe a tactic in one place doesn't work in another place, or vice versa. Interesting. So you've obviously you oversee a significant amount of activities. You oversee a very, very large organization that focuses on a lot of very discrete types of businesses, addressing specific health-related issues and specific health-related outcomes. Sharing some wisdom that you've gained over your years of leadership, what advice would you give to a new leader, let's just say in the not-for-profit space, who is taking over the role of CEO of an organization? What advice would you give? How does one navigate this crazy job of being an executive in a not-for-profit?
It's a very appropriate question, because I will be retiring in June of 2026 after 3 years. And I will reflect on those 3 years and identifying some key elements of what I will call potential challenges for nonprofits going forward, specifically leadership. I was fortunate to be part of a group that with some other nonprofit CEOs, where we, in response to funding challenges, we formed a group, and it supplies support emotionally, but also informationally, where you have ways to respond to funding reductions. You have ways to access advocacy. You have ways to have access to professional skill sets that can help you. Well, it's 150 nonprofit leaders in that group. And we did a survey, and consistently the things that come up are financial literacy, access to capital, and access to capital becomes a challenge for nonprofits, small, big, and large. They all will have challenges along those lines. Obviously, on the smaller end, it's just not having such things as a line of credit. And then on the larger end, it is, how do I gain efficiencies in how we do our back office support of the good work that delivers services? And doing so is going to be taking technology to speed up our financial management. Is it an ERP being maximized? Is it installing an ERP? These are things that can help financial management. And the idea is not to displace jobs. The idea is to give more freedom to people delivering direct services, so they're not burdened by inefficiencies and the back office work that's necessary for those nonprofits. So I would say concentrate on technology and how it will make back office support better. And then secondly, real estate is frequently an albatross towards efficiency on the general administrative costs, because nonprofits sometimes are given real estate, we acquire it. Well, we have to be very, how should I say, honest in assessing, is holding on to property necessarily part of our mission, and make sure that part of our G&A, general administrative expenses, is not preventing us from doing other things that are mission related. And then Finally, one thing I've learned is we have to appreciate there are experts in delivering services. They are thought leaders in behavioral and physical health, but they frequently have not been trained and or supported on the business side. So when we have these unexplained events that no one foresaw, i.e. COVID, funding reductions between a change in DC, or simply funders changing their preferences on how a service should be provided. Well, that type of organizational change is something nonprofits have to have the skill set to move more quickly reacting to. And they may have to elicit the support of consultants if it's financially feasible, and accessing what I would call, and I'm taking a page from my for-profit days, if you're assessing merging or strategic alliances, you need to put together a deal team. You need to have accounting expertise. You need to have legal expertise, policy expertise, and frequently what I will call someone to operationally equate, do these pieces fit together from a programmatic standpoint. So that deal team is going to allow what is going to be more and more the norm, merging and strategic alliances, because that's the future survival of many nonprofits, and not replicating something and having the honest decision, can I work with someone who does this better? Are we in the right space? Are we the best to deliver this service? And most importantly, what do we do really well? And how can we focus on doing more of it?
I love that answer. And I love the way you broke that down too, because one thing definitely feeds into the other. And if you think about going from the first thing that you mentioned, this mindset of financial literacy, that you need to have your back office buttoned up so that you can produce the data the right way. So that, and it's not that you're trying to automate it in such a way that you're replacing jobs. You're trying to say, no, I need to be efficient, because if I can't produce the data right, my program team can't communicate the impact on the back end. If I don't have a good, solid, consistent infrastructure on the front end, I can't merge in 4 companies and expect it to operate in a consistent way. And if it can't operate in a consistent way, it makes the burden on G&A administration and everything much more difficult. And I know even in the not-for-profit and accounting world, we're big into mergers and acquisitions. I know our firm Witham has been bringing in multiple firms in multiple different disciplines. And my experience leading some of those acquisitions is the second somebody joins, how do you promote consistency so that we all work together? I think that's a very, very big part of that aspect. And from a leadership part, how do you stick to your principles, communicate those principles in a transparent way, regardless of the impact that those communications are going to have on the recipient of them, knowing that in 5 years, it's better to be direct in year 1 as opposed to 5 years later and try to dance around the topic. No, it doesn't work that way. We're one business. We have one mindset towards it. So yeah, I appreciate that. I definitely appreciate the concept of real estate. I think a lot of charitable organizations get into real estate, and sometimes that real estate supports their business. Sometimes you ask the question, let's say there's new leadership. I've been at many nonprofits. I asked the new leadership, why do you have that? They're like, we have no idea. We actually have no idea why we own that tract of land. I'm like, all right, well, do you need cash? They're like, yeah. I'm like, why don't you sell it? It sounds like good, valid cash flow, especially in 2026 or 25 when the real estate market was, high relative to what it's been in the past. And lastly, surrounding yourself with experts. I think from a leadership principle, I really can value that. I myself, as I've elevated to the role I'm in here, I have surrounded myself with a significant number of experts who I always thought I was the expert. And I'm like, I learned really quickly as the leader, I was not the expert anymore. I need to surround myself with people that are. And then my job is helping with the decision making. It's helping with driving the mission, driving the core and the principle, and setting the tone, not necessarily the one that's physically doing everything. And that was I know for myself as a younger leader, that was a hard thing for me to accept, because I always thought I had to be the end all be all. And what you said, it's no, you need to set up your deal team, and then you need to bring in, as you said, if you have doing an M&A, I need to bring in the accountant, the lawyer, the COO or the operations person. I need to have the change management person. That's a new thing I've heard. People have a director of change management. We do here, and it's needed because you need someone who's going to look at it and say, that's great that we change things, but how are we communicating those changes? How are we integrating those changes? How are change A integrating with change B, and how are they working together? And how do we track that? And yeah, all salient points. And I really appreciate your wisdom on that.
I have seen this firsthand in some of my professional engagements. And you highlighted this in your summary, that frequently, if you don't engage integrating a newly acquired entity properly from the start, the after effects, the lingering effects can create siloed organizations that never reach their potential in getting the synergies that first drove those two groups to come together. And sometimes the fix is more painful than anything that can be gained from that partnership or acquisition. Because if you don't have shared core values and you don't have trust that centralized support services can provide better, more efficient ways to help you do your work, you create a world of workarounds. And those workarounds are inherent inefficiencies in terms of gaining economy of scales, gaining the benefit of group purchasing, all the things that allow you to leverage size get diminished when you're working around that, and siloed organizations are replicating functions that could be done jointly.
Yeah, great point. Could not agree more with that, and certainly very important. And almost, how I react to that is I think about, like, do we take stock of, from original deal days, like, what were all the discussions? What were all the things that we promised and that you promised? Like, do we ever take stock of that 6 months later, a year later, 2 years later, to the point of tracking outcomes? Why did we do this? Well, we did this for X, Y, and Z reason. 6 months later, is that happening? Are we owning our promise as the acquirer? Are they owning their promise as the acquiree? And what are the impediments to doing that? I think that's one area that we're go. It's just like next thing. Do we take stock of that? Do we actually take a step back and say, did we evaluate that? And to the point, applying the Band-Aid you think is fixing it, but it's not. Then you got to rip the Band-Aid off, which is way worse than the initial. So yeah, good point. So you've mentioned a lot already, and I know in our conversations, and obviously defer to you as an expert in this world of mergers and acquisitions, about strategic alliances. And I want to talk about that a little bit. I want to explore that a little bit. We haven't talked too much about it on the show, and also I think there's a lot of valuable wisdom that you've gained over your years that really benefits the industry as a whole. In talking about that, how have you, as a not-for-profit organization, approached M&A?
I hope the mindset going forward, and part of the legacy I hope to ingrain in PHMC, is one in which previously we were approached by funders. There's a program in trouble. It does excellent work. Can you prop it up? Well, we, in the effort to support the community, frequently took on those types of emergency situations. I would argue, while not ruling them out, because sometimes the programming is so important, it has to be maintained, I would argue we have more discipline in doing what we talked about earlier, a due diligence process, and doing an assessment. Is this something that can be saved without dragging everything with it? And that discipline is very hard when you have good-natured, well-intended social service experts who want to help, but have to be guarded against in that process to make sure it is a healthy move for the organization holistically. And that is tough. And there's going to be a lot more of those tough decisions as we see many service providers contracting. And not everybody will make it, and nor should they. But there are some folks that are doing great work that maybe won't make it because they have attempted to bite off more than they can chew, and that drags the organization down. So you have to be very mindful of how do we measure the ability to bring on additional work in a meaningful way where the mission is maintained. We do not dilute our back office to where we are not covering administrative costs properly. and it has to be sustainable both programmatically and economically. And then you've done a good move.
Without a doubt. How do you maintain that? Because I think that the challenge is, and you brought up a very good example. Funder or outside force says, "Hey, we really think you should take this on. This fits in with what you do. This is how you approach it." How do you go about evaluating that opportunity? But also, how do you let's say you have a relationship with that outside party, like let's say it's a predominant fund, like it's the city, or how do you maintain your relationship so you don't just say, nope, not in our best interest, we can't do it? That might have ramifications. How do you think about that, or how do you approach that from a relationship perspective with the person approaching you?
The best way to guard against retaliation or the fear or threat of retaliation is to articulate, and here's where the due diligence process supports you. When you're able to come up with pro formas that generate performance long term, and it's not viable, and can share that information with your funding partners, it gives you credibility. And then the other way is diversifying your services in a meaningful, strategic way allows you to not have risk all in one area. And what do I mean by that? I was a member of a captive insurance group for years. And the trick there was diversity. You didn't want all the wheat farmers in Kansas, because if the boll weevil comes, you're all wiped out. You want to diversify in certain areas so that if things change, you're supported. So if you're going to do a merger, acquisition, strategic partnership, does it fit your mission? Does it expand your ability to carry that mission out? And what unique function or element in the community is addressed through this merger or acquisition? And does my deal team, once they've done the legal risk, and legal risk can be future litigation, it can be current litigation, it could be a multitude of things. And then you can look at the risk financially. Is this going to be adequately funded? Are we reimbursed at a rate that allows this to continue and grow? If that acquisition or deal team can answer all those questions and you're still providing good service, but it does not pencil out as sustainable, and you have that work, you're less likely to have the opposition of the funder if that can be presented in a succinct, complete way.
Not sharing an emotional argument, but sharing factual engagement on, well, we appreciate this, we've analyzed it, and the facts of the case don't line up with our traditional approach. And a couple things that I call out of what you said there that I find very, very valuable. You keep bringing up this concept of a deal team, but also we as an organization have a consistent approach of how we approach these things. We have a model. It's not just every single thing is in a vacuum and, oh, this business is dead. No, we approach the analysis of it in a very similar way. And, the accountant in me, what's very funny is a lot of times when we get, talking about very technical accounting, you start looking at discounted future cash flows and valuing certain assets from that perspective. And a lot of times we'll get in there and we'll be like, how'd you guys come up with those future projections? And then, everyone looks at you. You're like, you don't know? Like, isn't that an important part of like why this is joining you? I'm not saying it's the only reason is to generate future cash flow, but if you're acquiring something and you have no idea how accurate a future projection is, or that you put thought into obviously future projections can change, things can upend that, variables. However, if you don't go through that analysis to begin with, how do you know that this not only is going to be viable for our programs, but also viable for our finance? I think those are very, very important points that often I know just, we're auditors sometimes is on the back end of it, and we ask these questions and people look at you like a deer in the headlights. You're like, uh-oh, this can't be good.
That's where nonprofits can benefit from adding to their board. Also, people gone through that deal process, because the due diligence in a private equity environment, that transfer is you have GAAP-led accounting principles, and an owner says, this is worth 50 cents. And then an acquirer says it's worth 10 cents. Well, they're both using the same principles. How do they arrive at different numbers? And I think it's important to know that you can have different perspectives. And part of it is getting into the assumptions on how those things were derived. And then you can judge what is good or bad analysis. And I'm also fortunate to be on the board of an ESOP, Urban Engineers. And an ESOP is designed to grow shareholder value for the employee-owned company. And part of that is being able to calculate the value of that stock. And that value has to be demonstrated in what can be at times very difficult ways of assessing performance and profitability. Now, is it perfect? No, but just the discipline gets you closer to a real answer of having to do that on an annual basis.
Very interesting. You mentioned the board here, and you said bring some people on the board. How do you approach the board of directors as a whole when it relates to mergers and acquisitions, as far as inclusivity or non-inclusivity of the board? How do you go about talking to the board about the challenges, or how do you lean on the board for help when it comes to this area of mergers and acquisitions?
That's a very complex answer because, first of all, a good CEO of a nonprofit should realize where they stand in the pecking order. And first and foremost, you work for the board. But that assumes the board is comprised of responsible leadership. And there'll be many nonprofits out there where there are gaps in that board. So I would advise the chair of the board getting an assessment and being very clear on the skill sets that are necessary for the board to oversee its strategic plan. And those skill gaps will lead to recruiting, filling those positions to augment the skills necessary to properly advise the board on here are areas that we can improve upon in terms of knowledge base for the board. And the other thing is CEOs have to not try to manipulate information, but report to the board. And frequently you get in trouble if you're not. And I try to bring the same, and this I will attribute to being a military officer. You have to follow, you have to obey because corporate structures essentially are things that were borrowed from the military and the church historically. And those structures, you can be critical of them, but once we understand and follow, to an earlier point you had made, it's a surety to folks, both on the senior leadership positions, those in the middle, and those who are rising to get to those levels, that we do follow core values, translate it in a strategic plan, implement it through a strategic vision. And that's going to dictate the skill sets that compromise our board. And we're going to adhere to best practices. We're going to update our bylaws. We're going to do the things that keep us functioning in a way that is accountable to our funders. And more importantly, by the grace of the IRS, we maintain nonprofit status. Well, we have to do the things that don't compromise that status as an organization.
That's a tough balance to strike. And I do agree with you from a lot of the principles. I'm in the fire service world, and I take a lot of the which are adopted to them from the military, go into the fire service. I take a lot of those principles and apply them to my business, not-for-profit world, a lot of the organizations I work with. And the most common, as you said, like having that hierarchy or that chain of command is very, very important, but also the principles behind reporting structures and why they exist, and being able to report things accurately and completely in the right time is critical. And also that leadership, the board as a whole, how are they identifying their strengths and weaknesses? Are they doing a risk assessment? Are they doing a SWOT analysis, if you will, on, where are we? Do we have a lot of people retiring and we're going to lose talent? Do we have a lot of young talent that hasn't experienced our business? Do we have people, are we missing an attorney on our board that does this type of work? Are we missing an accountant or a CPA or a nonprofit accounting expert? Are we missing X, Y, and Z? Consistently going through that process because, businesses consistently evolve, as you said, but also the board itself is driving the overall vision and mission. And you as the CEO is reporting up to the board. And a lot of times the CEO kind of has the dominant voice, but also they do report to the board. And I think that those two things have to work in conjunction. And I imagine that sometimes those, there's odds there, or, it's probably not easy to balance that, especially when you could have a board member that's super passionate about the mission of an acquiree. But then you're the CEO, like, hold on, I appreciate your point. However, that organization can't be sustainable in our organization. How do you balance that? How do you balance this concept of acquiring a mission-related organization to may not be as financially viable, to maybe difficult to implement in our business? Where does the balance come in all that? Because I imagine that's a very difficult balance to strike.
It is a difficult balance. However, we happen to be in a time period where no one is unaware of the fiscal challenges for service providers. So it's a much easier argument to make in this environment. I think it would have been tougher several years ago. In fact, growth is probably the tougher challenge in this environment. And that is, how do we justify growing in certain areas if there is a question of a surety of funding, if there is a question of continued need? That can sometimes be the trickier part to present to a board in this current area that we find ourselves in, of what is the right reallocation of resources to be mission aligned, and what is the right allocation of resources to be most responsible with that alignment. And what do I mean by that? Well, we talked earlier about putting an ERP implementation, well, that costs money and it costs time in the present to do something like that. Is that the right investment if, for instance, we're a nonprofit and we start to see a spike in a specific area that we have to address on an emergency basis? Let's roll back to COVID and getting people vaccinated. Well, you have to make a conscious choice to delay process improvement because you have to, say, address an immediate need of a pandemic. So you have a strategic plan, but that does not mean that a tactical necessity will override it in many cases. And that balance does require board and senior executive alignment so that those tough decisions can be maybe not unanimously made, but made with a working majority supporting it.
You bring up an interesting point with also a strategic plan. And I always think about this. How often do we update our strategic plan? How often do we focus on our strategic plan? And are there events that tactically override that strategic plan, or should they, to your point? They might not, probably should not. How do we revisit that? How do we evaluate that? Sometimes the strategic plan that I've seen at organizations is we came up with it, we put it on a shelf. Is it actionable? Is it a plan to how we invest in things? Is it a plan to how we can be nimble in times of extreme change, like COVID itself, or the way that we changed how we go about, working has drastically upended our business. But, we may have to modify that strategic plan. How often do we modify our strategic plan, or how often do we revisit it to say, is this strategy still correct in the current times? I know, us here, we modify it frequently. I mean, I think, and not necessarily modify the values of it, but we say, hey, wait a minute, we were going to do X, Y, and Z, and that no longer makes any sense. Like that no longer is viable for our business based on public events. Maybe we do need to change it, or maybe we don't, because just because public events are changing, that doesn't mean we should change our strategy. That just means that we have to ride the storm. It could be one of a myriad of things.
Yeah, it would be like having a strategic plan to repair IBM typewriters after the PC was introduced. Ground changing approaches to doing something, which have to be incorporated in what you're seeing. So that assessment does have to be done frequently because things now change very rapidly.
The world changes rapidly.
Right. And I know this is, you figure PHMC has just under 2,000 employees. And you would think something like a phone system. Well, having a hard wired phone system as opposed to doing, and even if we move to voice over IP, well, why can't we do that through our computer? And these are one of the challenges of things that seem very simple, but when you put the numbers to it, can dramatically impact how do we provide service. And then we look at a software package like Epic and how it helps process our direct physical care service providers with tools to speed up that process so that maybe we can see more patients during that time period instead of less patients. And we don't have to work up the chart because that chart is memorialized in HIPAA compliant software like Epic. So it can be very difficult to know what is the right allocation of resources. And while the planning process is not perfect, it forces you to have some way to make those decisions. And more importantly, why those decisions were made at the time lives in minutes, strategic plans, and other documents, so that should you replace leadership, people have a way to understand what was the mindset when that decision was made.
Very important and often not always there. So that's a valuable point. And just as I think about that, documenting things, auditor and me love documenting things, very important. But documenting the mindset of like, this was the decision and why we made it. A lot of times board minutes and things will just say, we made this decision, move on. And sometimes that's, liability driven. I think about what you just said too. And I'm like, what should be in our job descriptions in certain roles is this like planning aspect, our involvement in the strategic direction. If you're putting out an application for a CFO of an organization, is that part of it? Sometimes we just focus on, you're going to run the finance function. You're going to oversee our mission delivery. You're going to oversee X, Y, and Z. Do you actually say that they're a part of your strategic plan? And I think that they need to be. And oftentimes organizations, businesses don't always allocate the resources needed to do the strategic thinking or allocate the time to do, as you said, we're moving a mile a minute. Everything changes rapidly. A lot of times we're, as I say, I'm a firefighter outside of here. I always say I put out fires literally and figuratively, and it's always like this. And how do we make the time for these activities, because they are the things that are going to drive our organization into the future. And as important as they are, sometimes people lose sight of the active mindset towards that strategic plan thinking as opposed to the day-to-day. This is what I do on a day-to-day. It's super interesting.
It relates to what you do. The planning part is not an exercise in futility. It's an exercise to helpfully guide you. And in these times where your time is taken in many directions, unless it's scheduled and it's planned with intentionality to get everybody around these topics, we don't do it. And that becomes a problem. And the other challenge I find is, how do you know you have the right people or they have the right skill sets to execute these things? And that assessment's got to be made from time to time, because you may have the right talent there, but they have to be trained to execute what's being put before them.
Yeah. And how do you know? Yeah. And especially as businesses evolve, you hire someone for a role at a certain point in time. And I look at it with your business. And if we hired someone when we were 300 million and now we're 900 million, is that person still the right mindset for where we are? How often do we, not saying they aren't, but more, how often do we revisit that? And then are we offering training? I think about here, I morphed into roles from, staff up to, leading a practice of a couple hundred people. And I look at it and I'm like, when are we offered leadership training? Or like, each leader struggles with different things. Like I may struggle more with the managing people side. Some other people don't struggle at all with managing people side. Some people struggle with the analytical side and coming up with strategy. Some people don't struggle with that at all. everyone has a different mindset. How do we intervene in that at the right time that we continue to make our leaders successful? So a very, very valuable point that you brought up there, because how do we continue to invest in our talent? It might be the right person at the right time, but also are they evolving with the practice, with the business? So last but not least, I always like a call to action here on this podcast. I like to hear from you. The way that I generally ask this question is, how can the public help PHMC?
The public can help PHMC in many ways. Volunteering is always an option. We talked about, we have a multiplicity of boards, and our website, phmc.org, could give you some idea of where you could engage us. That's one way. Obviously, with those multiplicity of services provided, we would be remiss if we didn't say the need for fiscal support in terms of donations from foundations, individuals. And quite honestly, that's something we've done poorly because we've been a fee for service and a grant recipient organization. With the gap in funding, we're going to have to get better at developing and soliciting support from the philanthropic world beyond the traditional grant tourists that we've worked with. And that is in the process. Another way to help is simply being supportive and advocating for the social service network through elected officials, them being mindful of what changes can impact their communities if not done with careful consideration. And that's not advocating for one way or the other. It's just being informed and knowing that you have a stake in this, because while you may not be receiving our services, you can be impacted by the lack of them being provided.
Yeah, really appreciate that. So those out there, there are certainly a lot of ways that you can help PHMC as a whole. You know, Michael's certainly dedicated his time today to help many leaders out there understand the management of this business, but also just understanding how the organization as a whole operates, why it serves as significant public need, how it approaches that from a strategic perspective, and how it responsibly goes about its processes and practices. So yeah, Michael, with that, I mean, I really appreciate you dedicating your time to have this conversation. Your wisdom is certainly very valued by us, and certainly appreciate you sharing that and sharing some of the stories that you share with us today. So really appreciate your time being on the show today.
Thank you.
And Warriors, thank you for listening. Why don't you subscribe and meet us right back here for another episode of Witham Civic Warriors, and have a great day. Bye, everybody.